Good morning, church. How are we feeling today? Good. You guys sound incredible. I have a policy of trying to save my voice and holding off on my own singing after a few songs, but you guys were so good this morning. I found myself caught up in the flow, and that's not a bad flow to be caught up in. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started this morning. You've heard Adam start off this morning with a verse that reminds him of the work that we do here. In particular, he was speaking about the Brighter Days Food Pantry. And I don't know if some of you guys are aware, we spent Wednesday filming that top to bottom so that we could begin to tell the story really well of what God is doing through that ministry here at Leander. It's really pretty ridiculous if you think about it. If you guys are unaware, there's about $25,000 worth of food that goes into the local community every single Wednesday out of this parking lot. Do the math, that's $100,000 a month in food aid, and that's over $1 million a year. Now that is incredible. Serving 250 or so families a week, that's more than there are people in this room right now. If you think about the kind of impact of God multiplying 5 loaves and 2 fishes to this community through the hard work and effort of those involved in this ministry and some willing partners that we have in this community by the grace of God. I bring this up just because these type of incredible numbers and impact don't happen without people. And one of the things that we really want to do is build relationships with the community around us. And so more than just putting food into their car and meeting that temporal need, we want to meet the spiritual need. You might be surprised that one of the things that clients of the Pantry report being of the greatest impact to them is the fact that they can come and receive prayers. And some folks come through and even want to pray for those who are volunteering their time. We want to get much more intentional with creating those connection points with our community that's coming week after week after week. And so we've envisioned something that is tentatively, this may change, called the God Squad here, and we want a group of volunteers to come together from our church family, and your job at the pantry is not going to be to push a cart or hand out food. Your job is just going to be to meet people. Share a genuine word of encouragement. Pray with them if they want to be prayed with. Let them pray for you if they want to pray for you. But a collection of people that will be there in the parking lot, canvassing and creating personal connections with the people of this community so that they know that they are not just cattle coming through to get their feed for the week. They are people that we love and deeply care about and want to see their lives changed. We are looking for folks that want to make a difference in that way. Never underestimate how far a genuine word of kindness and taking care actually be in someone's life, how far that will actually go. So if you're interested in being a part of that, maybe you haven't felt, the right time to get involved with that pantry ministry here or another ministry, and you're looking for a place where you can really be a part of something special, this opportunity is available to you. I would ask that you would track down Terry Sue or me or Lady J in the office who's actually pulling the strings behind everything, and let us know that you want to be a part of that. There will be a meeting soon, and we'll talk about what that looks like, but that is going to be a great work into this community. Also, as has been mentioned before, you'll notice that Travis is here. Everybody look at Travis. Say hi, Travis. Hi, Travis. We love you. He has done an incredible amount of work at any hour we have asked of him this entire week. And for the rest of the time, you guys just to pretend like he's not here. Do not look him in the lens. It's kind of like staring right into the fire. Don't do it. Bad things happen, okay? Let's start with a question this morning, and it's a question that I didn't plan to talk about, but we have to do some science. We feel like this is going to be a good control group, and this might come out of left field, and you might not know what I'm talking about. We'll move on and pretend it never happened. But I want to ask, think in the last week, how many people in this room, and raise your hand if this is you, if in the last week, in some way, shape, or form, you have thought about the Roman Empire? The math seems to check out. I am staying up late watching a game. Maggie, of course, who loves football, has decided she's just going to go to bed and sit on her phone. And I get an ominous text out of the bedroom, and it just says, "Hey, I got to ask you a question. Just answer it honestly. I'm trying to figure something out." I'm like, "Okay, what is that?" And she says, "How often do you think about the Roman Empire?" I was like, "Why?" I mean, it's pretty present. Like, there's a lot of things about the Roman Empire you still see today. It makes a big impact. But daily, at least weekly? And then she started sending me a slew of these videos where women everywhere have become concerned because they've realized that the men in their lives think about the Roman Empire daily, at least weekly, and they never assumed that that would be the case. To the contrary, women almost never think about the Roman Empire, and that got us working down the line of what is this in our lives that would cause men to be so obsessed with perhaps the second greatest empire to ever rise on this planet, and women to never think about it. I would like to submit this morning that men and women have different versions of knowing things, okay? The title of this message is, I'm going to tell you something you already know, and that's going to mean different things to different people. But just bear with me for a second, because I think the math will check out on this too. Ladies love to talk about what? When they come in the room and they're ready to spill the tea, right? They get really excited about all the juicy bits of what happened, what so-and-so did, what they said, what the response was, okay? And at some point in the conversation, there's a dude with glazed over eyes because he stopped about halfway through the list and he fixated on one thing that she said, and he's not thinking about what happened or the tea, he's thinking this, but why? And he's not going to move off of it. And then we will ask the question, especially if it was a problem that was presented, we'll say, well, babe, why didn't you just? And then the lady looks annoyedly at you and says, you're not even listening to me, are you? But this is the difference in how men and women know things. See, women like to know what, and that's enough for them. They're moving on to the next thing. Guys, we think about why and how. I can prove this to you. Every single man in this room, at some point when they were growing up, had a toy or object in their house that may or may not have been valuable. And one time their parents walked in on them and they looked at it and it was strewn across the floor and disassembled. And the parents said, what are you doing? Well, I took it apart. Why? That's your favorite toy. I wanted to see what was inside. Still, that's your I wanted to see if I could put it back together. Most times, we're unable to put it back together. So for ladies, it's enough to know that the Roman Empire existed and they're done with it. But guys are like, yeah, but how? How did they conquer the entire world? How did they come up with the road system? How did they come up with aqueducts and sewage? And how did they come up with running water? And what made them so strong? And what was the cause of their fall? And why is the American empire running a similarly concerning course in all these different ways? And we're all caught up in the pieces of how it worked. Ladies, I just want to let you know, he is listening, but like he's really, really listening to that one thing, and he's going to tear it apart, okay? And guys, they don't think about the Roman Empire because the truth is they just really don't care that much. It existed, and that's good enough. And when you try to explain something to them that they already know, they're going to say, how dare you mansplain the Roman Empire to me? Mansplaining. We come by it naturally. So I'm going to ask for some grace this morning, because I'm going to tell everybody some things that I think we already know. And if you'll allow me, I'm going to mansplain a little bit, because sometimes the things that we already know are the things that we actually need reminded of, okay? So, let's talk about the culture of our text this morning. We are in Acts chapter 17 for the last time, I promise. Remember, in verses 16 through 21 last week, we talked about how Paul immersed himself into this marketplace, this Areopagus, and he saw the world that was underneath the world of idols. He saw people that were given over to literally any and everything, and he was filled with this complex indignation and compassion for a people that did not know the God in whose image they were made. He didn't see them through the eyes of just a disapproving Jew who was repulsed by them or afraid of them, but he saw them through the eyes of God. And we talked about the significance of this Greco-Roman marketplace, the Agora, how it was the epicenter of the arts and finance and culture, how it was basically a combination of LA and New York City, and you can throw Oxford and Yale and Harvard in there, because the Areopagus that we're at today is the seat of all the high-thinking intellectuals of the time. Stoics, Epicureans, Aristotelians, all kinds of philosophies that you guys don't want to be bored by today, but we have to do it a little bit in just a few seconds, just a little bit, promise, okay? Paul threw himself into this space with intention. And I just quickly want to mention that it's worth thinking about that Paul was not intimidated by the affluence of the culture that he found himself in. He was not intimidated by the fact that they had lots of things figured out. In philosophies and styles that are still present with us today, some of the greatest thinkers of all time. He launched headlong right into the fray, and he engaged with the culture in a way that we're not used to seeing. He was able to do so because he believed fully that the gospel was able to stand toe-to-toe with the leading philosophies of the time and meet the test of scrutiny. And not just meet the test of critique, but to overcome and dog-walk the philosophies of the day. Paul taking the gospel to the Agora daily meant that Paul believed that the gospel wasn't this just private self-help thing that you did to feel good about yourself and find enlightenment and find purpose. It means that Paul saw the gospel as something that he couldn't not share with people that he actually cared about and that he actually loved. So my first question for us this morning before we head up to the hill at the Areopagus is, do you believe in a gospel like this? Or do you feel confident that whatever the world is promising people, the gospel actually stands over it? Do you believe that what people actually need to fix the painful holes in our culture and in their lives is the gospel? Does it compel you to take it to the marketplace? Or do you privatize your power? Do you believe in another power? Maybe you think that the answers to our problems are political or educational or social. Have you boiled the problems of people down to platforms? Because Paul didn't boil the problems of people down to platforms. If you read here, he's reasoning in the marketplace, and they come to him, they say, what does this babbler want to say? The word for babbler actually means a seed-picking bird. What kind of an image does that evoke in your mind? I thought about putting that SpongeBob picture up here where they capitalize and lowercase the letters to mock somebody with his arms out like a chicken. That's what they came to Paul. Jesus is Lord. They're really mocking him. So my question was, how does the gospel win in a culture where it's being mocked openly in the marketplace? That is a relevant question for us today. Remember, the Stoics that it says Paul is engaging here and the Epicureans that Paul was engaging here are people that are still around today. So we have to see how the gospel overcame this, because that's how the gospel is going to overcome even today. Remember, the Stoics were the moralists. They did believe in moral absolutes, but they believed that the point of life was to be good. They thought that the gods probably existed, but they were remote, kind of deistic, like they wound it up and let it go. Very Thomas Jefferson-ish approach to how the gods interacted with people. More than that, they thought that the way to win was to never be won over by emotion. There's really no point better than being good, and you can't be good if you're constantly at the mercy of your emotions. So one famous Stoic is even quoted as saying, when you lay your kid down to bed at night and to tell him good night, whisper in your own ear, he's going to die. So you don't get too attached. So you don't feel the emotional turmoil when something bad happens. And every father has a little bit of Stoic in him. We love to teach our sons, you don't cry. You be a man. You be tough. You don't let them get to you. Don't let them see you sweat. We love the ideal of Stoicism. But as it turns out, even in the Greco-Roman world, it's really not practical or reasonable. You realize that being fully Stoic leaves you embittered, hard, callous, without purpose. Imagine a life where you feel like you can't actually get close to anybody and nobody can get close to you. Is that fulfilling? What does that do for you? And the Epicureans were there too, but these were the relativists. They didn't believe that there was actually a point to life, so they said, eat, drink, and be merry. You might as well just have a good time, because when you die, that's it. None of this ever even mattered. And if the gods exist, they're distant and pernicious and they don't care about us. So have a good time. Live while you're young. Does that sound familiar to anybody? They also believed in extreme radical sexual freedom. Hey, go be with anybody that you want whenever you want, because you might as well have a good time. How does the gospel win in a culture where this is kind of the rule of norm? Because as it turns out, the Epicureans would learn, and the Greco-Roman world would learn, that when you use sex as something to make yourself happy or find identity in, it presents and creates nothing but a crushing loneliness and a purposelessness. It's a dead end. And this is why I think we should laugh when people say, hey, the Christian view of sexual ethics is outdated. It's so quaint that you guys, we need to get modern, and people need to be able to do whatever they want, whatever makes them happy. Without realizing that 2,000 years ago, that's exactly the environment that Christianity was born in and swept the board philosophically with as a way of living a fulfilling life. Christianity doesn't come along now and hold back process when people say, hey, you should just be with whoever you want. Christianity is saying, we've been there, we've seen this movie, guys. We know where it ends. It's not new. So the gospel comes along to the Epicurean and says, no, there's a purpose to life. There are moral absolutes. And if you take hold of this hope, you'll replace the loneliness of hedonism with a fulfilling community and family. And we have these in our culture too. Paul's point is that every culture has its Achilles heels. Every culture has the places where it's trying to solve the problems of the human experience that are common to us all. We're not so different from them. Our modern culture struggles with the fact that we desperately want community, but we worship our individualism, so we always destroy it. Our modern culture struggles with the fact that we feel like we want to create our own identities, but the burden of being defined by relationships and accomplishments and what I say I am actually crushes me under the pressure of having to live up to that standard, one that I'm always falling short of and people don't approve of. We live in a culture and a society that wants to have morality, but we have no real basis for it, so we're stuck with our feelings. Yeah, we've got the same problems today, and we still have Stoics and Epicureans. We just don't call them that. We have the same sickness just as badly as they did, and I'm here to tell you that just as they were in those days, we don't have the solutions that speak to the deepest needs of humanity outside of what Paul is going to give them in Acts chapter 17. So Paul goes in, and though he is mocked, he engages the culture in such an effective way that he gets invited to speak at the Areopagus, the crown of thinking and academia of the time, the council of the elites, the leading intellectuals, the influencers of the day. And he says in verse 22, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. He actually gives them some credit. He's not speaking to them condescendingly. He's not speaking with disdain. Verse 23, for I passed along and observed objects of your worship and found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you. I'm here to fill the hole. I'm here to fill the gap. You see, Paul saw underneath the idolatry and underneath the culture. He knows that the gospel addresses the Achilles heels of their system and their paradigm. He doesn't attack it the way that we do, though. See, Paul's engaging in something called Socratic dialogue and debate, and it's different from the debates that you're going to watch during this entire intellectual or this entire election season. See, Socratic debate is different. Our modern debate is when I stand on my platform and what I believe, and I shoot arrows at your position and try to burn it to the ground. Even if I have to stand up a straw man that's not even really accurate about your position and what you believe, even if I have to make personal ad hominem attacks because I can't deal with your argument, I'm just there to convince people that I'm right and you're wrong. That's how we do debate now. And it's a far cry from what Paul is actually putting on display here. That's not how they did it in the Greek world. The Greek way of reasoning and dialogue was that you get inside the other person's world and you learn it to the bottom and you find out the places where there's cognitive dissonance in their paradigm. You find out the weaknesses from inside and then you ask questions about those places so that you can defeat the worldview or the argument on its own premises, not with your own argument or your own superiority. So Paul doesn't show up to the Areopagus and say, let me whip out Isaiah and tell you about the real God. He shows up from inside their culture. I want you to remember something. When you make an attempt to convince someone of something, whatever it is, but especially in spiritual matters, matters that are really close to people's identity, how do you go about it? Do you attack their view from the outside? How's that going for you? Do you try to convince them and sell them that what you have is somehow better and they've been idiots the whole time for believing what they believe? How's that going for you? When's the last time you actually changed someone's mind on Facebook? Well, just a question. Just a question. Just think about it. Just think about it. I want you to remember something that Paul knew, and that's this. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Say it again. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. It means that even if your argument is superior, they're just going to make up a personal attack and go the other way. Okay? The truth about the human condition is we have to want to believe that something is true before we're willing to consider how it may be true. This is why when Christians have a terrible witness in the world around us and people don't want to be a part of us and they don't want what hypocrisy looks like and they don't want what snobbery looks like and they don't want what judgmentalism looks like, it doesn't matter if you present the most airtight argument for the existence of God, they're going the other way. And it also means whenever they feel real connection and real love and real sacrificial spirit, when they see something that they can't get to and they can't get out of the world, they will want to know what makes it tick. They're going to tear apart the fire truck on the floor like a 7-year-old boy. They got to know what's going on. That's a lesson for us to remember. What if we had conversations like we see Paul having, instead of conversations like the world around us is having? What if that was our approach? What if we actually commended the opposing worldview where they were actually right about something or on the right track? What if we didn't attack it from the outside, but instead asked really good questions from the inside and let those questions reveal the places that could help them get to what they're really searching for from the beginning? What would our outcomes look like, church? Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined and allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling places. I want us to think about how Paul is redefining their understanding of what a God is. One of my favorite ministers, when he's engaging the secular world in the marketplace, people who say they don't believe in God anymore, he says, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in, because I might not believe in him either. And this is what Paul is saying when he comes to the Areopagus. You see, he's saying and expanding their idea of what it means to really be a God. And the God he's presenting is way different and way bigger and more powerful than any God they've come in contact with before. The Greek and Roman gods, if you've read anything about them, they're basically people with powers. Every foul thing that comes out of humanity is present in the stories and mythologies of the Greco-Roman pantheon. They are haughty, they are lascivious, they beef with one another all the time, they kill each other, they have affairs with one another, they are constantly betraying one another, they're angry, they have to be placated, they probably won't call you back, they'll wait 3 days and then send a text, oh, I didn't see it, they saw it. They saw you at the temple with your offering. They're basically just projections of us. They're the type of God that, if you remember a couple of weeks back, we talked about how we need a God that isn't just a projection of our deepest needs. That's what the Greco-Roman pantheon was. And the way that you worshiped these Greek and Roman gods was that you had to appease them. You had to buy them off. Like, you better make sure you make an offering to Poseidon before you get on the boat, if you catch my drift. But these were not gods that you could actually come to love and have a relationship with because they didn't deserve it. They were just like you. You entered into a relationship with this God to try and kind of get them to do what you wanted them to do to make your life go the way that you wanted it to go. And before you get too judgmental about people worshiping that kind of God, I want to ask you if you ever showed up to church because you thought, well, if I start getting right with God, maybe my life will get right too. This is human nature. This is why Paul doesn't judge them when he goes there. He sees, he understands, he knows. Examine the way you think about God right now before you cast judgment on these people Paul is talking to. Think about it real deep. You better pray through that, church. But what Paul does here is brilliant. It's a masterstroke approach in engaging the culture. He finds this altar to an unknown God. And the way that it's presented is as if they have a God to literally everything, and somebody got really insecure or scared. They were probably in Enneagram 6, and they said, we better make one to the one we forgot, because if he exists, he's going to be really mad that we don't have an altar to worship him too. And Paul comes across this, and he recognizes this as the Achilles heel in their cultural view. He saw it as a sign of the fact that these people knew there was a God that they didn't know, that they actually do sense a God that they can't quite identify. And so Paul comes to the Areopagus and he says, I know you can sense it. And I know humans hate it when they hear this, but I'm going to tell you something you already know. That God is the creator of the world in verse 24. He made the world and everything in it. This is a radically different view from the gods of Greco-Roman world where they were, and many times, created themselves or birthed themselves. This is a contingent God. He just necessarily exists. This is not the Eastern pantheistic all-spirit that is just kind of made of the same stuff as everyone else, and you can sense and experience, but you could never really talk to or relate to or have a relationship with. In verse 25, he says he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. You don't buy this God off. He can't be domesticated. He's dangerous. He can't be manipulated. He can't be placated. because he doesn't need anything from you. In verse 26, he says he's the Lord of history. He determined the times for people and the exact places where they should live. He said, no, Marcus could have been born on a mountain in Tibet in the 1400s, so he better not be braggadocious about what he has in America in the 2020s. This is a God who's already done the math. And what's more, in verse 27, he says that this God did these things so that men would seek him and find him, that he made men for fellowship with him, that he wants us to be in connection with him. Paul's saying that this God doesn't need our obedience, but he desires a relationship, not just loyalty, not just someone who's going to come and bring their offering every week to try and placate him. This is a God bigger than they've ever considered, and maybe it's a God bigger than you've considered too. It's a God more present and personal than you ever dared hope or dream, yet it's a God that wants a relationship with you. And Paul's not done. In verse 27 and 28, he says, even in your own popular writings and thinking, some of you have bumped up against the realization that this kind of God exists, a God that holds up every second. In him we live and move and have our being, one of their own poets said, and that we're all actually created by him and we are his offspring. He's not coming with the Old Testament scriptures to prove a God that exists from outside their worldview. He's inside their worldview, bringing their own poets and saying, you guys already know this God exists. Look at your own people. It's like he came to a meeting of the Ivy League school deans and started quoting Kendrick Lamar and Jordan Peterson. Is that a wide enough disparity for you guys? I think it is, because some of y'all are like, what is a Kendrick Lamar? Paul is coming and saying, look, I'm not going to prove this God exists to you. How often are we just out to prove that God exists? I'm not going to prove this God exists to you. I'm going to prove that you already know him. I'm going to prove you already know he's there. You sense him. You sense the clues in your own writing. You sense it in your own thinking. You sense it in your own behavior. And we do this modernly today too. One of the examples that I found as I was studying to deal with this text again was another minister referencing an article that I went and tracked down. It was a lady who's a cultural anthropologist. This was actually some years ago. And she was doing work for women's rights in Africa. Very different climate in Africa. I'm very familiar with what that looks like. She's a secular lady. She doesn't believe that God exists. So she goes over to Africa and she's working for equal women's rights. She doesn't like the way that women are being treated in Africa. And she says to them, you got to stop treating women this way. There needs to be equality in how we treat men and women. And they looked at her and they said, how dare you? First of all, how dare you? By the way, that's Maggie's favorite phrase whenever I get in trouble. I don't know if they said this, but I imagine them saying this. First of all, how dare you impose your white, Western cultural views on us? And her response to that was, I know they're technically correct. I don't believe that God exists, so who am I to go and say that my cultural views and my view of morality, which is a cultural construct, is better or superior to their cultural views and their view of morality, which is also a cultural construct? And yet, even though I know they're technically right, and I have no basis for this, I have to believe that equal rights for women is a universal truth. And so even though I don't actually have a basis for this, I'm going to continue to work for it. Do you sense the cognitive dissonance just dripping from that statement? Look, if you don't believe in God, you can account for moral feelings. You could say, I don't really like the way this feels. But if there is not an objective standard by which you measure good and evil, right and wrong, you could never say that you have moral obligation. You could say, I don't like the way it feels when you do that to me. You could never say, it's wrong that you did that to me. And our culture is obsessed with progression in a way that validates human rights, validates social rights, validates equality, and we never get there without messing it up and destroying it because we want to do it without the only basis that justifies it. You'll never get there without God. You see, Paul would have said to this cultural anthropologist, and Paul would say to our world today, your work in Africa for equal women's rights is an altar to an unknown God. You sense that this is true. You know deep down that this is true. And yet you won't admit he exists. Because if you admit he exists, he has a claim on your life. We don't like that. We don't like being told something that we already know. So, Paul says you sense him, you know he has to be there, your life and beliefs don't make sense unless he's there, and yet you won't admit that he's there. Paul is inside the culture. He's immersed in a world of idols. He's doing something new, really, with Israel's ancient understanding of idols, and I hope something new for us too. He is proving that idols of culture are nothing more than a cultural self-deception, a collective self-deception. Our idols are the points where human fantasies and wishes and hopes and dreams get tied into material realities, and they get distorted into some never-to-be-fulfilled hope or longing. Our idols create the illusion of hope and control in my life and the life of God. That is, people try to draw gods or whatever they believe into a common cause with them to sustain blessings in their life. Cosmic Santa Clauses, we want the gods to be. The creation of our idols is a self-projection, and our worship and devotion of them is the only thing that keeps them alive. Because what we discussed earlier about these Stoic and Epicurean points of view couldn't solve the problems and the hurts in the human experience the way the gospel could. And as a result, even though they called Paul a seed-picking bird, even though they mocked him 150 years from the day that he stood on the Areopagus, all of the Greek and Roman gods had been beaten as badly as if Daniel Jones was their quarterback. Just a clean sweep. Just get him out of here, man. No one talked about him anymore. You know, you might be listening and thinking, well, Marcus, you really did tell me a bunch of stuff I already knew. But I want us to step off our high horse for a second. I want us to consider that people who don't believe in God, like that anthropologist I mentioned, or the Athenians, aren't the only ones with altars to unknown gods. You see, these Athenians, Paul proved, sensed that they knew this God that he was preaching, but they hadn't worked down the implications of what it meant for a God like that to exist. They hadn't accepted the claim on their life that this type of a God, this type of a dangerous, unmanipulatable God makes. It's not a God we can control or buy off and appease. It's a dangerous God because of all of our idols outside of pride. Control is probably the biggest one. And so we, even who know God by name, make little altars in our lives, little piles of stone to keep things going the way we believe they absolutely have to go. Even though we serve this great God, we remain anxious and fearful day in and day out. We heap up little stones of career and people's opinions and our relationships and what people think and how much money we make and what success is and will I leave a legacy, and we build these altars to an unknown God every day. If you want to truly rest, family, you have to believe that God has already done the math. Not just that he exists, but he is the Lord of history. And not just that he's done the math, but that he's done the math right. Paul would say to the Athenians on this occasion that the resurrection of Jesus proves it. And if you're reading the text, you'll notice that Paul doesn't even really get to finish his sermon. As soon as he mentions the resurrection, they hook him off of there like it's Night at the Apollo. Cain and the clown comes out, you're done, son. Because if it's true, if God raised Jesus, I lose control, whether I like it or not. The deepest need of our heart and the deepest longing of our being is for this to be true, but we hate it, and we hate it because we sense it. We hate it because we're, in a sense, being told something we already know. And the resurrection is a fact of history that I can't be indifferent about. It can't be true and me continue to go around building my little altars to unknown gods, trying to placate the forces of the universe into giving me a good life and making me feel good about myself. Willie Jennings put it this way. He said, all religious speech, no matter how carefully stated, no matter how ecumenical or affirming, no matter how polite, shatters at the resurrected body of Jesus. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, there is no longer religious speech, but speech that challenged reality, reorients how we see earth and sky, water and dirt, land and animals, and even our own bodies. It is speech that evokes a decision. You can either laugh at it like they did in Athens, or listen to it. You can leave, or you can draw near to the God that wants a relationship with you. But let me tell you something you already know, church. You can either have the resurrected body of Jesus, or you can have your piles of stones. There is no in between. Paul embodies the gospel in his time in Athens. He knew he was going to be plunged into brokenness, knowing he was going to be mocked, rejected, but he did so in love with an indignant compassion. He saw and loved his culture enough to engage them the way that he did, and he was able to do it because he knew that the God he was going to preach to them also looked down at our culture and our brokenness, and with a righteous indignation and a heart full of compassion, plunged himself into this place, engaged us, not harshly, but with a kind of love that turns the world upside down, topples powers, defeats pantheons, crushes ideologies, and causes us to be gathered here in his name today. Might we all have such love, church? I'm going to tell you something you already know. As Paul said, God is not far from any one of us. All it's going to take is for you to put down your stones and draw close to the resurrected body. I and the rest of the shepherds are here to do so. If we can serve you in that way today, I would ask you to come as we stand and sing.